My wife and I once had a mountain cabin, but we moved to the city for her health. I hadn't gone back for 15 years. She went there every holiday. When she passed away, my kids said, "Sell that useless shack." I decided to visit before selling, but when I opened the basement's trapdoor, I froze at what she was hiding down there. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached. I stood in front of the mountain cabin, my hands trembling as I gripped the rusty key. 15 years. It had been 15 years since I last set foot in this place, and now, 3 months after Crystal's funeral, I was finally here again. The wooden steps creaked under my weight, each sound echoing through the silence like an accusation. The drive up had been brutal. 2 hours of winding mountain roads, my knuckles white against the steering wheel as memories crashed over me like waves. Crystal used to make this trip every holiday, every long weekend, sometimes staying for weeks at a time. "I need the mountain air for my health," she would say, her voice soft but determined. "The doctor said it would help with my breathing." I never questioned it. Why would I? Crystal had always been fragile, delicate in a way that made me want to protect her. When we moved to the city 40 years ago, leaving this cabin behind, it was supposed to be temporary. Just until she felt better. Just until the specialist could figure out what was wrong with her lungs. But temporary became permanent. And I got caught up in work, in providing, in the endless cycle of city life. "Dad, you need to get rid of that useless shack," my son Michael had said at the funeral reception, his voice sharp with impatience. "What's the point of keeping it? Mom's gone and none of us want to deal with some falling apart cabin in the middle of nowhere." My daughter Sarah nodded in agreement, already calculating numbers in her head the way she always did. "The property taxes alone are a waste of money, and the drive up there is ridiculous. Just sell it and be done with it." They talked about it like it was nothing, like it wasn't the place where Crystal and I had spent our first years of marriage, where we had dreamed of raising children surrounded by pine trees and mountain silence. Like it wasn't the place Crystal had retreated to every chance she got for the past 15 years, always returning with color in her cheeks and a peace in her eyes that I rarely saw in the city. But they were probably right. What did I need with a mountain cabin at 60 years old? Crystal was gone, and with her went any reason to maintain this place. The smart thing would be to list it with a realtor, take whatever money I could get, and move on with my life. That's what I told myself as I drove up here today. I was just going to do a quick walkthrough, assess what needed to be cleared out, maybe take a few photos for the real estate listing. Get it over with so I could finally close this chapter of my life. The key stuck in the lock and I had to jiggle it for several seconds before it finally turned. The door swung open with a groan that seemed to echo through the mountains. The smell hit me immediately, a mixture of pine wood, old fabric, and something else. Something distinctly Crystal. Her lavender soap, maybe, or the lotion she always used. For a moment I could almost pretend she was just in the next room, waiting for me to call out her name. The living room looked exactly as I remembered it, only smaller somehow. The furniture we had bought together in our 20s, the braided rug Crystal's mother had made for us as a wedding gift, the stone fireplace where we used to sit for hours, talking about our future. Everything was clean, well maintained, as if Crystal had just stepped out for a walk. I moved through the rooms slowly, each one stirring memories I had buried under years of routine and responsibility. The kitchen still had the yellow curtains Crystal had sewn by hand, now faded but still cheerful. The bedroom still smelled faintly of her perfume. Everything was preserved like a shrine frozen in time. It wasn't until I reached the back of the house that I noticed something strange. There was a door I had forgotten about, one that led to what used to be a small storage area under the house. But this door had a heavy padlock on it that definitely wasn't there before. The wood around the frame looked newer too, as if it had been reinforced recently. I stared at the lock, confusion creeping up my spine. Crystal had never mentioned renovating anything down here. In fact, she rarely talked about the cabin at all when she came home from her visits. She would just smile that peaceful smile and say it was nice to have time to think, time to breathe. I had assumed she spent her time reading, maybe gardening, doing the quiet activities that brought her joy. But why would she need to lock a storage area? What could possibly be down there that required such security? I searched through Crystal's purse, which I had brought with me along with her other belongings from the car. Her keyring was complicated, full of keys I didn't recognize. Some were clearly for the cabin, others for our city house, but there were several small keys that could fit a padlock. It took 3 tries before I found the right one. The lock clicked open with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the mountain silence. I pulled the heavy door open and peered down into darkness. There were stairs leading down, wooden steps that looked much newer than the rest of the house. The air that drifted up was different too. Not musty like I would have expected from a basement, but clean, almost sterile. My hand found the light switch on the wall and I flipped it on. Light flooded the space below, and what I saw made me catch my breath. This wasn't a storage area at all. The entire basement had been completely transformed into something I couldn't have imagined in my wildest dreams. The walls were painted white and lined with professional lighting. There were easels positioned around the room, canvases both finished and unfinished, brushes organized in neat rows, tubes of paint arranged by color like a rainbow. The floor was covered with drop cloths, spattered with years of creative work. This was an art studio, a real professional art studio. But that wasn't the most shocking part. The most shocking part was the paintings themselves. They covered every available wall space, dozens of them, maybe hundreds. Landscapes that took my breath away. Portraits so lifelike they seemed to watch me as I descended the stairs, still life compositions that made ordinary objects look magical. The technique was masterful, the style confident and mature. These weren't the works of a hobbyist or someone playing around with art as a pastime. These were the paintings of a serious artist, someone with real talent and years of experience, and every single one of them was signed with Crystal's name. I stood at the bottom of the stairs, my legs suddenly weak, staring at a wall of paintings that my wife of 40 years had created in secret. Crystal, who had always claimed she had no artistic ability whatsoever. Crystal, who would laugh and shake her head whenever anyone suggested she try painting or drawing. Crystal, who had spent decades telling me and everyone else that she was terrible with anything creative. My hands shook as I moved closer to examine the paintings. They were dated, some going back more than a decade. 15 years worth of secret art, created during her solitary trips to the mountain cabin while I stayed behind in the city, working late and never questioning why my wife needed so much time alone. The style evolved over the years, I could see that much. The earlier paintings were more tentative, still beautiful but less confident. The recent ones were breathtaking, showing a mastery of light and color that took my breath away. She had been getting better, growing as an artist, developing her voice all these years while living a completely different life up here in the mountains. In the corner of the room I found a small desk covered with paperwork. My heart pounded as I approached it, afraid of what else I might discover. The first thing I saw was a letter from a gallery in Denver, dated just 6 months ago. "Dear Miss Whitmore," it began, and I frowned at the unfamiliar name until I realized it must be a pseudonym Crystal had been using. "We are delighted to inform you that your latest collection has sold completely. The response from collectors has been extraordinary. Please find enclosed your check for $12,800. $12,800. I stared at the number, my mind struggling to process what I was reading. Crystal had been selling her art. Not just painting as a hobby, but actually selling it to galleries, making money, building what looked like a real career as an artist. How was this possible? How had she kept this enormous secret from me for so many years? And more importantly, why had she felt the need to hide it at all? I sank into the chair at the desk, my hands trembling as I reached for more papers. There were contracts with galleries, receipts for art supplies, correspondence with collectors who praised her work. An entire professional life that I knew nothing about, conducted under a name I had never heard. The woman I thought I knew, the quiet, fragile wife who needed mountain air for her health, had been living a double life. And as I sat surrounded by the evidence of her secret passion, I realized that Crystal's trips to the cabin had nothing to do with her breathing and everything to do with breathing life into the artist she had hidden from the world. But why hide it from me? Why couldn't she trust me with this beautiful part of herself? As I stared at the paintings surrounding me, each one more stunning than the last, I felt something cold settle in my stomach. What else about my wife's life had I completely failed to understand? I spent the next 3 hours going through every piece of paper in that basement studio. And with each document I found, my understanding of my wife unraveled a little more. Crystal hadn't just been painting as a secret hobby. She had built an entire career as an artist, complete with multiple gallery representations, a steady collector base, and what appeared to be substantial income that I knew nothing about. The desk drawers were meticulously organized, everything filed and labeled in Crystal's precise handwriting. Gallery correspondence contained letters from 6 different galleries across Colorado and New Mexico. Sales records held copies of invoices and payment confirmations going back 12 years. Commission requests overflowed with inquiries from private collectors asking Crystal to create custom pieces, but it was the folder marked Financial Records that made my hands shake as I opened it. Bank statements from an account I had never seen before, one that Crystal had opened 15 years ago under her pseudonym Eleanor Whitmore. The balance on the most recent statement was $57,432. $57,000. More money than Crystal and I had in our joint savings account. Money she had earned entirely on her own, from art she created in secret, while I thought she was just getting mountain air for her health. I flipped through the statements, watching the account grow steadily over the years. Deposits of $2,000 here, $5,000 there, sometimes as much as $8,000 in a single month. The woman I had been married to for 40 years had been earning more money from her art than I made in some months from my job at the hardware store. My chest felt tight as I continued reading. There were other accounts too, smaller ones but still significant. A savings account with nearly $20,000. A certificate of deposit worth $15,000 that had been automatically renewed just last year. Crystal had accumulated a small fortune, and I had no idea any of it existed. But the money wasn't what hurt the most. It was the realization that my wife had felt the need to hide this entire part of herself from me. That she had created a secret identity, opened secret accounts, built a secret career, all while pretending to be the simple, fragile woman I thought I had married. I found myself staring at a painting on the wall nearest the desk, a landscape of mountain peaks bathed in golden light. It was signed E. Whitmore in the bottom corner, the same signature I had seen on all the financial documents. Eleanor Whitmore. Who was Eleanor? Was that who Crystal really was when she came up here alone? Was Eleanor the woman she wanted to be but couldn't be with me? The thought made my stomach clench. Had I somehow made it impossible for Crystal to be herself? Had I created an environment where she felt she had to hide her talents, her passions, her very identity? I tried to remember conversations we'd had about art over the years. Crystal would sometimes stop in front of paintings at the rare times we visited museums together, studying them with an intensity that I had attributed to casual interest. She would make comments about technique or color that seemed surprisingly knowledgeable, but when I asked where she had learned about art, she would just shrug and say she read about it somewhere. Now I understood. She hadn't been reading about it. She had been living it, creating it, mastering it in secret while maintaining the facade of being artistically clueless. I found a small photo album tucked behind the bank statements, and when I opened it, my breath caught. Pictures of Crystal at what looked like gallery openings, standing next to her paintings with other artists and collectors. In these photos, she looked different, confident, radiant. Her hair was styled differently. She wore clothes I had never seen before, and her smile was genuine in a way that I realized I hadn't seen in years. There was Crystal shaking hands with what appeared to be a gallery owner, a red dot sticker visible on the painting behind them, indicating a sale. Another photo showed her demonstrating painting techniques to a small group of people. Her hands animated as she explained something about brushwork. She looked like a teacher, an expert, someone people respected for her knowledge and skill. When was the last time I had seen Crystal look that confident about anything? When was the last time she had shown that kind of passion, that kind of joy? The answer hit me like a physical blow. I couldn't remember. In our day-to-day life, Crystal was quiet, accommodating, always deferring to my opinions and preferences. She cooked the meals I liked, watched the television shows I preferred, socialized with my friends and colleagues. I had thought of her as sweet and agreeable, a perfect wife who never caused conflict or demanded attention for herself. But looking at these photos, I realized that wasn't contentment I had been seeing all these years. It was resignation. Crystal had learned to hide her true self so completely that even her husband of 40 years had no idea who she really was. I found more evidence of her deception as I continued searching. art supply receipts that she had clearly paid for out of her Eleanor Whitmore account, professional photography costs for documenting her work, even expenses for art classes and workshops that she had attended, apparently during her health trips to the cabin. The woman I thought needed mountain air for her breathing problems had actually been attending advanced painting seminars and networking with other professional artists. She had been building a career, developing her skills, creating a name for herself in the art world, all while telling me she was just resting and relaxing. The betrayal of it cut deep, but underneath the hurt was something else: shame. How had I failed so completely as a husband that my wife felt she had to construct an entirely separate life? What kind of marriage had we really had if Crystal couldn't trust me with her dreams? I remembered now how she would sometimes mention wanting to try painting, years ago when we were first married. I had dismissed it gently but firmly, telling her that art supplies were expensive and we needed to focus on practical things, on building our life together. I thought I was being responsible, guiding us toward financial stability. But maybe what I had really been doing was crushing her spirit so thoroughly that she learned never to mention her dreams again. At least not to me. I found a small notebook tucked under the photo album filled with Crystal's handwriting. It appeared to be a journal of sorts, but focused entirely on her art. The entries were brief but revealing. Sold 3 landscapes today. One entry read, "The collector said my use of light reminded him of the Hudson River School painters. I was so proud I wanted to call Norman and tell him, but I stopped myself. He wouldn't understand. He still thinks of me as the woman who can barely balance our checkbook." Another entry from just last year. "Eleanor had her first solo show today. Sold nearly everything. I keep wanting to share this joy with someone, but Eleanor's life has to stay separate. Norman loves his quiet, simple wife. He wouldn't know what to do with an artist." The words hit me like arrows, each one finding its mark. Crystal had wanted to share her success with me, but she believed, rightly or wrongly, that I wouldn't understand, that I wouldn't support her, that I preferred the version of her that stayed small and quiet, and didn't challenge my idea of who she should be. As I sat in that basement, the studio surrounded by the evidence of my wife's secret brilliance, I realized that I had lost her long before she died. I had lost her the moment she decided that her true self was something she needed to hide from me. And the worst part was, I was beginning to suspect that she might have been right to hide it. Would I have supported her artistic career 15 years ago? Would I have encouraged her to spend money on supplies and classes and gallery fees? Or would I have worried about the practicality of it, the uncertainty of artistic income, the time it would take away from managing our household? I was afraid I already knew the answer. I was afraid that Crystal had known me better than I knew myself, and that she had hidden Eleanor Whitmore not out of shame for her art, but out of protection for it. She had created a space where her creativity could flourish without my practical concerns and conservative judgment interfering. But as I looked around at the professional studio she had built, at the evidence of her success and talent, I realized that Eleanor Whitmore wasn't the lie. Eleanor was who Crystal really was when she felt safe enough to be herself. The quiet, fragile wife I thought I knew, she was the fiction Crystal had maintained to keep peace in our marriage. And now she was gone, and I would never have the chance to meet the real woman I had been married to for 40 years. I would never be able to tell her that I was proud of her, that her art was beautiful, that she should have trusted me with her dreams. Or maybe she was right not to trust me. Maybe I needed to earn the right to know Eleanor Whitmore before I could mourn her loss. It was when I opened the filing cabinet in the corner of the studio that the full scope of Crystal's deception became clear, and with it, a truth so devastating that it brought me to my knees on the paint-splattered floor. The top drawer was labeled "Family Expenses" in Crystal's careful handwriting, and inside were folders that made my blood run cold. Michael's college, Sarah's medical bills, Norman's heart surgery. Each folder was thick with documents, receipts, and bank transfers that painted a picture I couldn't have imagined in my worst nightmares. I opened Michael's folder first, my hands trembling as I read through what appeared to be 4 years' worth of tuition payments. Not just any tuition payments, but payments that I remembered differently. Payments that I thought had come from somewhere else entirely. When Michael had gotten into that expensive private university 8 years ago, Crystal and I had agonized over how to pay for it. I remembered the stress, the late-night conversations about taking out loans, the worry that we would never be able to afford it. Then suddenly, miraculously, Michael had come home one day saying he had received a special scholarship that would cover most of his costs. The documents in front of me told a different story. There was no scholarship. Crystal had paid his tuition herself, $43,000 per year for 4 years, all from her Elena Whitmore account. $172,000 that she had quietly transferred to cover our son's education while letting me believe it was some kind of financial aid. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the letter I found paper-clipped to the final tuition payment. A letter from Crystal to the University Bursar's office. "Please ensure that this payment remains confidential," it read. "My son believes he has received institutional aid, and I prefer to keep it that way. This arrangement has allowed him to feel proud of his academic achievements without the burden of knowing his mother sacrificed her own dreams to pay for his education." My vision blurred as I read those words. Crystal had paid for Michael's entire college career out of her art income, then made sure he would never know about her sacrifice. She had let him believe he had earned his way into school, that he deserved that education on his own merits, while she quietly sold painting after painting to cover costs that would have crippled our family finances. And I had never suspected a thing. Sarah's folder was even worse. 8 years ago, when Sarah was diagnosed with that rare autoimmune condition, we had faced medical bills that seemed impossible to pay. The treatment she needed wasn't fully covered by our insurance, and the out-of-pocket costs were staggering. I remembered the panic, the sleepless nights wondering how we would come up with $25,000 for the experimental therapy her doctors recommended. Then our insurance company had called to say there had been a billing error, and that Sarah's treatment would be covered after all. We had celebrated, grateful for what seemed like a bureaucratic miracle that saved our daughter's health and our financial future. But here were the real records. Crystal had paid for Sarah's treatment herself. $24,700 transferred directly to the medical center from her secret account. She had then apparently called the insurance company herself, pretending to be from the medical center, and arranged for them to tell us the charges had been covered. My daughter's life had been saved by her mother's secret art career, and none of us had ever known. The folder marked Norman's heart surgery made my chest tighten with something that felt dangerously close to a heart attack itself. 2 years ago, when I had needed emergency bypass surgery, we had faced the terrifying prospect of massive medical bills, even with our insurance. The surgery itself was covered, but the rehabilitation, the medications, the follow-up care, all of it added up to costs that threatened to drain our retirement savings. But somehow, mysteriously, many of those bills had been adjusted or written off. I had attributed it to hospital charity programs or insurance negotiations that I didn't fully understand. I had been so focused on recovering, on getting back to normal, that I hadn't questioned our good fortune. Crystal had paid $18,600 of my medical expenses out of her own secret earnings. While I was lying in a hospital bed, worried about how we would afford my recovery, my wife was quietly selling her art to ensure that my health wouldn't destroy our financial security. I sat on the floor of her secret studio, surrounded by the evidence of sacrifices I had never known she made, and finally understood why she had needed this separate life. It wasn't just about hiding her artistic talents from a husband who wouldn't understand. It was about creating a financial safety net for a family that would never have accepted her help if they knew where it came from. How had she managed it all? How had she created fake scholarship notifications, arranged phantom insurance adjustments, coordinated billing errors that saved us hundreds of thousands of dollars while maintaining the illusion that it was all just good luck or bureaucratic competence? The answer was in another folder labeled Correspondence. Crystal had apparently spent years learning to navigate insurance systems, medical billing departments, and university financial aid offices. She had studied the language they used, learned the procedures they followed, and then carefully inserted herself into those processes to quietly pay for her family's needs without them ever knowing. There were draft letters she had written, practicing the official language she would need to convince a billing department that charges had been covered by a different department. Phone scripts she had prepared for conversations with insurance representatives. Research she had done on scholarship programs so she could create convincing documentation for Michael. Crystal had essentially become a one-woman charity organization for her own family, using her art income to subsidize our lives while letting us all believe we were financially independent. The organization, the attention to detail, the sheer determination it must have taken to maintain these deceptions for years while continuing to create and sell her art, it was staggering. But why? Why go to such elaborate lengths to help us while hiding it? Why not just tell us she had this income and offer to help openly? I found the answer in a small notebook tucked behind the correspondence folder, filled with what appeared to be Crystal's private thoughts about money and family. "Norman is so proud of providing for us," one entry read. "He works so hard at the hardware store, and I know it kills him that we struggle sometimes. If he knew I was earning more from my paintings than he makes in a year, it would destroy something in him. Better to let him feel like the provider while I quietly ensure we never actually go without." Another entry from around the time of Michael's college acceptance. "Michael is so excited about that scholarship. I've never seen him so proud of himself. If he knew his tuition was being paid by his mother's hobby paintings, it would take away from his sense of achievement. He needs to believe he earned this opportunity." And then most painfully, "They all think of me as the quiet wife and mother who doesn't contribute much beyond keeping house and providing emotional support. If they knew I was secretly the family breadwinner, it would change everything between us. They love me as I am, or as they think I am. Elena Whitmore would complicate their simple image of who Crystal should be." Crystal had understood something about our family dynamics that I had been completely blind to. She had recognized that my identity was wrapped up in being the provider, that Michael's self-esteem depended on feeling like he had earned his opportunities, that Sarah's gratitude for her medical care was tied to feeling like we had all sacrificed together to save her. So she had sacrificed in secret, creating elaborate deceptions to allow us all to maintain our comfortable roles while ensuring that money never became the crisis that could have destroyed us. She had been protecting not just our financial security, but our emotional security, our sense of who we were as individuals and as a family. And in doing so, she had made herself invisible. The real Crystal, the talented, successful, financially savvy woman who had quietly held our family together for years, had to stay hidden so that the rest of us could feel good about ourselves. I thought about all the times I had worried about money, all the stress I had felt about providing for my family, all the pride I had taken in being the responsible breadwinner. Crystal could have relieved that stress at any time simply by telling me about her art income. But she had chosen to let me carry that burden because she understood that I needed to feel useful, needed to feel like the man of the house. How many nights had she lain awake next to me, listening to me worry about bills that she could have paid easily? How many times had she watched me stress about expenses that were no problem for her secret account? How lonely must it have been to carry that financial security alone, to never be able to share the relief she felt knowing our family was safe? The woman I thought I had known, the simple mountain wife who needed peace and quiet for her health, had actually been the backbone holding our entire family together. And she had done it so skillfully, so quietly, that none of us had ever suspected we were living on the earnings of a successful artist. Crystal hadn't just been hiding her talent from us. She had been hiding her strength, her competence, her ability to solve the problems that kept the rest of us awake at night. She had made herself small so that we could all feel big. And now she was gone, and I was sitting in the ruins of my understanding of everything I thought I knew about my marriage, my family, and myself. The truth was devastating, but it wasn't finished with me yet. There was still one more folder in the cabinet, one marked future plans that would shatter what little remained of my assumptions about the woman I had been married to for 40 years. The folder marked future plans contained documents that broke my heart in an entirely different way. Where the previous folders had shown me Crystal's financial sacrifices, this one revealed the emotional cost of keeping those sacrifices secret. Inside were detailed plans for an art studio she had dreamed of building in our backyard, sketches of how she might convert our garage into a workspace, and most devastating of all, a business plan for opening her own gallery. But it was the journals I found beneath these documents that finally showed me who Crystal really was, and how completely I had failed her as a husband. The first journal was dated 10 years ago, and the early entries were filled with excitement about her artistic progress. Sold my first painting today, she had written. $500 for something I created with my own hands. I wanted to frame the check instead of cashing it. I can't believe someone saw value in my work. But as I read further, the tone began to change. Norman asked me today what I do up at the cabin all day. I told him I read and rest, which isn't technically a lie, but it felt awful. I want so badly to show him my paintings, to share this joy with him, but I remember what happened when I mentioned taking an art class 5 years ago. He said we couldn't afford to waste money on hobbies when we had real responsibilities. I stopped reading, my chest tight with recognition. I did remember that conversation. Crystal had mentioned wanting to take a watercolor class at the community center, something that would have cost maybe $60. I had dismissed it without really thinking, focused as I always was on our budget, on being practical and responsible. I had thought I was being a good husband, protecting our financial stability. But Crystal had heard something different in my response. She had heard that I didn't value her interests, that I thought her creative impulses were frivolous wastes of money. The next entry was even more painful. I tried to show Norman a painting I saw in a magazine today, something that reminded me of the view from our cabin. I started to explain why I thought it was beautiful, but he just glanced at it and said, "That's nice, honey," before going back to his newspaper. I don't think he even really looked at it. I wanted to tell him that I could paint something like that I have been painting things like that, but what would be the point? He's already decided that art isn't important. I had no memory of this conversation, which made it even worse. To me, it had probably been a throwaway moment, a brief distraction from whatever I was reading. To Crystal, it had been a tentative attempt to share her passion with me, and my dismissive response had shut her down completely. The journals chronicled years of similar moments, small interactions that I had forgotten but that had built up in Crystal's mind as evidence that I wouldn't support her artistic dreams. My practical concerns about money, my casual dismissals of anything that seemed impractical, my focus on work and responsibilities that left little room for what I thought of as leisure activities. Michael came home today excited about an art project he's working on at school. One entry read, Norman told him that art was fine as a hobby, but he needed to focus on subjects that would help him get a real job someday. I wanted to argue, to say that art can be a real job, but how could I when I'm hiding my own artistic career? I'm teaching my children that creativity doesn't matter by pretending it doesn't matter to me. That conversation I did remember. Michael had been maybe 12 years old, enthusiastic about a painting he was working on in art class. I had encouraged him to keep art as a hobby while focusing on math and science for his future. I thought I was giving him practical advice about building a stable career. But Crystal had seen it differently. She had watched me discourage our son's artistic interests while she was secretly building a successful art career of her own. She must have felt like a fraud, staying silent when she could have been an example of how art could be both meaningful and profitable. Sarah mentioned today that she might want to study graphic design in college. Another entry revealed. Norman immediately started talking about more practical majors, about how creative fields are unreliable. I sat there saying nothing, knowing that my art income could easily pay for her design school, knowing that I could tell her that creativity can be financially successful. But how can I encourage her dreams when I'm too afraid to admit my own? I remembered that conversation too. Sarah had been interested in design, and I had steered her toward business instead, worried about her ability to make a living in a creative field. With my encouragement, she had chosen accounting, a decision she had never seemed entirely happy about. But Crystal could have supported Sarah's artistic interests. Crystal was living proof that creative work could be profitable and fulfilling. She could have mentored our daughter, helped her understand the business side of creative careers, maybe even collaborated with her. Instead, she had stayed silent, watching me push our daughter away from the very path that had brought Crystal so much joy and success. The journal showed me a woman trapped between two identities. At the cabin, she was Eleanor Whitmore, confident artist and successful businesswoman. At home, she was Crystal, the quiet wife who deferred to her husband's practical judgment and kept her own opinions to herself. I sold a painting today for $3,000, she had written. My largest sale yet. The collector said it was museum quality. I wanted to celebrate, to take Norman out to dinner and tell him how proud I am of what I've accomplished. Instead, I came home and cooked his favorite meatloaf and listened to him complain about the cost of groceries. I live in two worlds now, and sometimes I forget which one is real. $3,000 for a single painting. At that time, I was making maybe $400 a week at the hardware store, and here was my wife earning more in one sale than I made in a month. But she couldn't tell me about it because she was afraid I would feel diminished, threatened, or somehow less valuable as a provider. She was probably right to be afraid. Reading these journals, I realized that I might not have handled the news well 10 years ago. My sense of self was so tied up in being the breadwinner, the practical one, the responsible adult in our marriage, that learning Crystal was more financially successful than me would have been devastating to my ego. But that realization only made me feel worse. What kind of man had I been that my wife felt she needed to hide her success to protect my feelings? What kind of marriage had we really had if Crystal couldn't trust me with her achievements? The later journals showed increasing frustration with the double life she was leading. I'm tired of pretending to be helpless with money when I'm actually managing investments worth more than $100,000, she wrote. I'm tired of acting like I don't understand business when I've been successfully negotiating with galleries for years. I'm tired of being the quiet little wife when I'm actually the one keeping this family financially secure. But she was also afraid of change. Sometimes I think about telling Norman the truth, one entry read. I imagine how it might feel to be honest about who I really am, but then I remember how he reacted when I suggested hanging one of those abstract paintings in our living room. He said it would look out of place, that our house wasn't fancy enough for that kind of art. How can I tell him that his wife creates that kind of art? How can I tell him that our house isn't fancy because I've been secretly paying for everything else? I remembered that conversation about the abstract painting. Crystal had seen it in a magazine and suggested we might buy something similar for our living room. I had dismissed it as too expensive, too fancy for people like us. I thought I was being modest, keeping us grounded in our middle-class reality. But Crystal hadn't been suggesting we buy expensive art. She had been hinting that she could create something beautiful for our home, and I had shut down that possibility before she could even voice it. The most recent entries, from just months before Crystal's death, showed a woman who was exhausted by the weight of her secrets. I'm getting older, and I don't know how much longer I can maintain this double life, she wrote. Eleanor Whitmore has achieved everything I ever dreamed of as an artist. My work is respected, my income is substantial, my reputation is growing. But Crystal Holloway is still the invisible wife who doesn't contribute anything meaningful to her family. I want to integrate these two parts of myself, but I'm afraid it's too late. I've been lying for so long that the truth would destroy everything. She was wrong about not contributing anything meaningful. She had been contributing everything. Our family's financial stability, our children's education and healthcare, our security and peace of mind, all of it had been quietly provided by the artistic talent she thought she had to hide. But she was right about one thing. By the time I was reading these journals, it was too late. Crystal was gone, and with her went any chance for me to tell her that I was proud of her success, that I was sorry for making her feel like she had to hide it, that Eleanor Whitmore wasn't someone she needed to keep separate from our marriage. The final entry in the last journal was dated just 2 weeks before Crystal's fatal heart attack. I've been thinking about telling Norman about Eleanor, she wrote. Maybe it's time for him to know who his wife really is. Maybe it's time for me to stop being afraid of his reaction and start being proud of what I've accomplished. I'm going to paint one more series, something special that combines the mountain landscapes I love with the emotional honesty I've been hiding. And then maybe I'll find the courage to show him everything. That series was still in progress when I found it. 4 canvases on easels around the studio, partially completed but clearly brilliant. Mountain scenes that somehow conveyed deep emotional truths about love and loneliness, success and secrecy, the beauty and pain of keeping parts of yourself hidden from the people you love most. Crystal had been planning to reveal herself to me. She had been working up the courage to integrate Elena and Crystal, to show me the full truth of who she was. But she had run out of time. And now I was sitting in her secret studio, surrounded by the evidence of a woman I had never really known, mourning not just her death, but my failure to create a marriage where she felt safe enough to be herself. I drove back to the city that evening with Crystal's journals on the passenger seat, and a decision crystallizing in my mind. For 15 years, my wife had protected our family from financial hardship while hiding her own remarkable talents. She had died believing that we would never accept or appreciate the real woman she was. But she had been wrong about one thing. It wasn't too late for the truth to come out. It was just too late for her to see how that truth would change everything. The next morning, I called both of my children and told them we needed to have a family meeting. Michael complained about having to drive over on a Sunday, and Sarah immediately wanted to know if this was about selling the cabin. "We need to discuss your mother's legacy," I told them, which was true enough. I just didn't mention that the legacy was far different from anything they could have imagined. They arrived at my house within an hour of each other, both wearing the impatient expressions of adults who had better things to do than humor their grieving father. Michael sat heavily in Crystal's favorite chair without seeming to notice or care about the symbolism. Sarah perched on the edge of the couch, already checking her phone. "Dad, we know you're having a hard time with Mom being gone," Sarah began in the condescending tone she used when she thought she was managing me. "But hanging on to that old cabin isn't going to bring her back. The practical thing is to sell it and move on." "Your mother was practical," I said quietly, and something in my voice must have warned them that this conversation wasn't going the way they expected. They both looked up, suddenly paying attention. I had brought one of Crystal's paintings with me from the cabin, a small landscape that I could carry easily. I unwrapped it now and set it on the coffee table between us. "She painted this." Michael frowned at it, the way he might look at a strange insect. "Mom didn't paint. She always said she wasn't artistic." "Your mother said a lot of things that weren't true," I replied. "She painted for 15 years. She was extraordinarily talented, and she made a considerable amount of money selling her work." Sarah's head snapped up at the word money. "What do you mean selling her work? How much money?" I pulled out Crystal's bank statements and set them on top of the painting. She had savings of nearly $100,000, all earned from her art. The silence that followed was deafening. Michael reached for the bank statements first, his eyes widening as he scanned the numbers. Sarah leaned over his shoulder, her breath catching as she saw the account balances. "This is impossible," Sarah said finally. "Mom never had this kind of money. We would have known." "You didn't know because she didn't want you to know," I said. "She spent that money taking care of all of us instead of herself." I pulled out Michael's college payment records and handed them to him. "Remember that scholarship you got, the one that covered most of your tuition?" Michael's face went pale as he read through the documents. "This says the payments came from a private account. Mom paid for my college? Every penny. $172,000 over 4 years. She let you believe you had earned financial aid because she didn't want to take away from your sense of achievement." Sarah snatched her medical payment records before I could hand them to her. "She paid for my treatment too, but the insurance covered it." "Your mother arranged for the insurance to think it was covered while she paid the bills herself. $24,700 to save your life, Sarah. Money you never knew existed." I watched my children's faces as the truth sank in. I expected gratitude, maybe remorse for how they had dismissed their mother's memory. What I saw instead was calculation. Sarah was already adding up numbers in her head, and Michael was studying the bank statements like he was planning something. "So, this money," Michael said slowly, "it's part of Mom's estate now, right? Which means it comes to us." The question hit me like a physical blow. Here I was, revealing their mother's incredible sacrifices, showing them how wrong they had been about her, and Michael's first concern was whether he would inherit the money she had earned. "Is that really your first question?" I asked. "You just learned that your mother was a successful artist who secretly paid for your education and your sister's medical care, and you want to know if you get the money." Sarah looked defensive. "Dad, of course we're grateful for what Mom did, but she's gone now, and this money could really help us. I have student loans from graduate school, and Michael's been talking about starting his own business." "Student loans that your mother would have paid if she had known about them," I said, my voice rising. "A business that she would have funded if you had ever bothered to ask about her life instead of dismissing her as a simple housewife." Michael shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Look, Dad, we didn't know Mom was hiding all this. That's not our fault. She chose to keep it secret. She kept it secret because she knew you wouldn't respect her for it, I said, the words coming out harsher than I intended. She was afraid that if you knew she was financially successful, you would treat her differently. She wanted to be loved for who you thought she was, not used for what she could provide. That's not fair, Sarah protested. We loved Mom. Just because we didn't know about her art doesn't mean we didn't care about her. I pulled out Crystal's journals and set them on the table. She wrote about you, about all of us. She wrote about how I dismissed her interest in art, how I steered you away from graphic design, Sarah, because I thought creative careers were impractical, how I told Michael that art was just a hobby. She watched us undervalue everything she cared about while she secretly excelled at it. Sarah reached for one of the journals, but I pulled it back. She wrote about feeling invisible in her own family, about wanting to share her success with us but being afraid we would either diminish it or try to take advantage of it. So what are you saying? Michael's voice was tight with anger. That we're terrible people because we didn't realize Mom was some kind of secret artist? How were we supposed to know if she never told us? You were supposed to know because you were supposed to pay attention to her as a person instead of just assuming she existed to take care of everyone else, I said. When was the last time either of you asked your mother what she was interested in? When did you last ask about her dreams, her goals, her thoughts about anything that wasn't related to cooking your favorite meal or remembering your birthday? The silence that followed told me everything I needed to know. My children had no answer because they had never thought of Crystal as a person with her own interior life. She had been Mom, the woman who handled the domestic details of family life, not Crystal, the individual with her own talents and aspirations. She paid for Michael's college because she wanted him to succeed, I continued. She paid for Sarah's medical care because she couldn't bear the thought of her daughter suffering. She never told either of you about it because she loved you enough to let you feel proud and independent. And now we're supposed to feel guilty about inheriting her money? Sarah asked, but her voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. You're supposed to feel something, I said. Anything besides calculating how much you're going to get. Your mother was a remarkable woman who sacrificed her own recognition to make your lives better, and the first thing you want to know is whether her death benefits you financially. Michael stood up, pacing to the window. Dad, I appreciate what Mom did for us, I really do, but she's gone. Getting upset about money she left behind isn't going to change anything. The money isn't the point, I said. The point is that you're proving her right. You're proving that she was smart to hide her success from you because you can't see past what it might do for you to what it meant for her. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, staring at the painting on the table. When she finally spoke, her voice was smaller than before. She was really talented, wasn't she? I looked at the landscape Crystal had created, the way she had captured not just the visual beauty of the mountains, but somehow the feeling of peace that came from being alone in nature. She was extraordinary, and she died thinking that none of us would ever understand or appreciate that about her. We could have understood, Michael said, but he sounded less certain now. If she had given us the chance. Could you have? I asked. Because you're getting that chance right now, and instead of asking to see more of her work or wanting to learn about her artistic journey, you're focused on the inheritance. You're doing exactly what she was afraid you would do. The truth of that observation hung in the air between us. I could see my children struggling with it, trying to reconcile their image of themselves as loving children with the reality of their reaction to Crystal's secret life. But it was too little, too late. Crystal had spent years believing that her family saw her as nothing more than a caretaker and service provider. My children's immediate focus on the financial implications of her death had proven her fears completely justified. So, what happens now? Sarah asked finally. I looked at my children, these adults who had benefited enormously from their mother's secret sacrifices while never recognizing her worth, and I made a decision that Crystal never could have made for herself. Now you learn what your mother really thought of this family, I said, and then you learn what she wanted done with her legacy. I hadn't told them yet about the final document I had found in Crystal's studio, the one that would change everything they thought they knew about their inheritance, but I could see that they weren't ready for that revelation yet. First, they needed to understand who their mother really was and how completely they had failed to see her. The reckoning Crystal had been too gentle to demand in life was finally going to happen. And unlike her, I was not going to protect my children from the consequences of their blindness. I waited until my children had fully absorbed the reality of their mother's secret life before I revealed the document that would change everything. It was a will that Crystal had written under her Eleanor Whitmore identity, separate from the family will we had filed years ago. A will that disposed of her artistic assets and earnings according to her true wishes, not the assumptions my children had been making about their inheritance. "There's something else," I said, pulling out the legal document I had found in Crystal's studio safe. "Your mother wrote a separate will for her artistic estate, all of her paintings, her art income, and her savings from 15 years of secret work." Sarah reached for the document, but I held it back. "Before you read this, I want you to understand something. Your mother spent years watching this family dismiss her interests, her opinions, and her contributions. She died believing that we would never value her for who she really was. This will reflect those beliefs." Michael's face had gone pale. "What are you saying, Dad?" I opened the document and began to read. "I, Eleanor Whitmore, being of sound mind and body, do hereby bequeath my artistic works and the financial proceeds thereof to the Crystal Mountain Art Foundation, a charitable organization to be established for the purpose of supporting rural women artists who lack family support for their creative endeavors." The silence that followed was absolute. Sarah's mouth fell open. Michael slumped back in his chair as if he had been physically struck. "She left everything to charity?" Sarah whispered. "She left everything to women like herself," I corrected. "Women whose families don't believe in their talents, women who have to hide their creativity to keep peace at home, women who sacrifice their artistic dreams to take care of everyone else." I continued reading. "It is my hope that this foundation will provide financial support and encouragement to artists who, like myself, have been forced to pursue their passions in secret due to family circumstances that do not value creative expression." Michael found his voice first. "This is insane. Mom was our mother. She can't just give away our inheritance to strangers." "She can, and she did," I said. "Everything Eleanor Whitmore earned belongs to Eleanor Whitmore's estate, not to Crystal's family. Your mother very carefully kept these two identities legally separate for exactly this reason." Sarah was shaking her head in disbelief. "But we're her children. We loved her. She can't have really believed that we wouldn't support her art." I pulled out one of Crystal's journals and read directly from it. Sarah dismissed my suggestion about graphic design as impractical before she even finished explaining her interest. "Michael thinks art is just a hobby for people who can't do real work. Norman has never once asked to see anything I've created, even when I've hinted that I have creative interests. They love Crystal the caretaker, but they would not respect Elena the artist." "That's not true," Michael protested, but his voice lacked conviction. "Isn't it?" I asked. "The first thing you wanted to know when I told you about the money was whether you would inherit it. Not whether you could see more of her work, not whether you could learn about her artistic journey, but whether her death would benefit you financially." Sarah was crying now, but whether from grief or frustrated greed I couldn't tell. "We didn't know, Dad. We couldn't support something we didn't know existed." "You couldn't support something you never bothered to look for," I replied. "Your mother spent 15 years dropping hints about her interests, trying to share small pieces of her artistic knowledge with you, hoping someone in her family would notice that she had depth beyond domestic duties. You all chose not to see it." I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the suburban neighborhood where Crystal and I had raised our children, where she had lived a quiet life of service while her true self remained hidden in a mountain studio. "There's more to the will," I said without turning around. "Your mother established specific criteria for the women who will receive support from her foundation. They must be over 40, they must be pursuing art despite family discouragement, and they must demonstrate financial need due to lack of family support for their creative work." "She's describing herself," Michael said quietly. "Exactly. She's creating the support system she never had for women who are living the life she lived. Women whose families are too practical, too narrow, too focused on conventional success to value artistic expression." Sarah wiped her eyes. "So we get nothing." After everything we've been through, losing Mom, and now we find out she was successful and we can't even benefit from her success? The question revealed everything that was wrong with my family's relationship to Crystal. Even now, even after learning about her remarkable sacrifices for their education and healthcare, my children's primary concern was what they would gain from her death. "You got plenty," I said, turning back to face them. "Michael, you got a college education worth more than $170,000. Sarah, you got life-saving medical treatment worth nearly $25,000. You both got years of financial security because your mother was quietly ensuring that our family never faced real hardship." "But that was different," Sarah protested. "That was her being our mother. This money, this is like a business asset." "This money came from the same source," I said. "Your mother's artistic talent that you never acknowledged. The only difference is that she's not alive to continue sacrificing her own interest for yours." Michael stood up abruptly. "I can't believe you're supporting this, Dad. You're going to let Mom give away a fortune to strangers instead of her own family." "I'm going to honor your mother's wishes," I said, "something I should have been doing while she was alive." The will contained one more surprise, one that I had saved for last. Your mother also left instructions for her art collection. She wanted it displayed in a permanent exhibition space that would tell the story of Eleanor Whitmore and the artistic career she built in secret. I paused, letting that sink in before continuing. She suggested converting the cabin into a gallery and artist retreat center, funded by her estate, where women could come to create art without judgment or family pressure. Sarah's face went white. "The cabin? She wants to turn our family cabin into some kind of art commune? She wants to turn her secret studio into a public testament to the creative spirit that survives even when it's not supported at home," I corrected. "She wants her story to inspire other women who are hiding their talents because their families won't understand." The irony was not lost on me. My children had wanted me to sell the cabin because they thought it was worthless. Now they were learning that it would become a permanent monument to their mother's artistic achievement, a place where her true legacy would be preserved for generations. Michael was pacing now, his anger barely contained. "This is ridiculous. Mom was obviously not thinking clearly when she wrote this. We can contest it. No judge is going to let a mother disinherit her own children to fund some charity for hobby artists." "Eleanor Whitmore was not a hobby artist," I said firmly. "She was a professional artist with gallery representation, collector relationships, and 15 years of successful sales. And her will was witnessed by her lawyer and 2 gallery owners who knew her work. It's completely legal and valid." Sarah looked up at me with desperate eyes. "Dad, you could fight this. You are her husband. You have rights to her estate." "I do have rights," I agreed, "and I choose to exercise them by ensuring that your mother's wishes are carried out exactly as she intended." My children stared at me as if I had betrayed them, as if honoring their mother's clearly stated desires was somehow an act of treachery against my own family. But I could see in their faces the same dismissive attitude that had driven Crystal to hide her true self for 15 years. They still didn't see her as an artist worthy of respect. They still thought of her success as money that should rightfully belong to them. They still believed that Crystal existed primarily to serve their needs, even after her death. "You'll change your mind," Michael said as he headed for the door. "When you've had time to think about this rationally, you'll realize how crazy it is to give away Mom's money to strangers." Sarah followed him, pausing only to say, "I hope you're happy, Dad. I hope Mom's art friends are worth losing your children over." After they left, I sat alone in the house I had shared with Crystal for 40 years, surrounded by the comfortable furniture and family photos that had hidden her true self so completely. I picked up the small painting she had created, studying the way she had captured both the beauty and the loneliness of the mountain landscape. For the first time since her death, I felt close to the real Crystal, the woman I had been married to but never truly known. Eleanor Whitmore had been generous and strong and remarkably talented. She had created beauty while carrying the burden of family responsibilities that no one else even recognized. She had deserved better than a husband who dismissed her interests and children who saw her only as a source of practical support. She had deserved a family that valued her creativity, encouraged her talents, and celebrated her success. Since I couldn't give her that recognition in life, the least I could do was ensure that her death created the opportunities for other women that she had never had for herself. 2 months later, I stood in the converted cabin, now the Eleanor Whitmore Gallery and Artist Retreat, watching the first group of women artists explore the space where Crystal had created her secret masterpieces. The walls displayed her complete collection, each painting labeled with Eleanor's signature and the story of the hidden artist who had created beauty while believing her family would never understand its value. The women who came to the retreat were painters, sculptors, writers, and musicians, all of them over 40. All of them pursuing their art despite family discouragement or indifference. They understood immediately what Crystal had been through, and they treated her work with the respect and admiration it had always deserved. Standing in that space, surrounded by Crystal's legacy and the women she had chosen to support, I finally felt the peace that had eluded me since her death. I had failed Crystal as a husband, but I would not fail Eleanor as the executor of her artistic estate. My children had not spoken to me since the gallery opened. They had made their choice, just as Crystal had predicted they would. When forced to choose between respecting their mother's artistic legacy and pursuing their own financial interests, they had chosen greed over gratitude. But Crystal had made her choice too. She had chosen to ensure that her life's work would support women who understood the courage it took to create art in the face of family indifference. She had chosen to transform her secret pain into public inspiration. As I watched these artists work in the space where Crystal had hidden her talents for 15 years, I realized that Eleanor Whitmore had achieved something more lasting than family approval. She had created a legacy that would outlive all of us, a place where women could be artists without apology, without secrecy, and without fear. Crystal had spent her life being invisible to her family, but Eleanor Whitmore would be remembered forever.